Well, thank you so much, and if you guys could give Jessica here a warm welcome, we'll get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Jessica Merkling. I am the only urban wildlife biologist in the Division of Fish and Wildlife right now for the Department of Natural Resources. For those of you that don't know me, it'll be helpful for you to know that I do work for DNR, but I do not work for a state park. I do not work for law enforcement. I'm not Division of Water, none of those things. I'm in the Division of Fish and Wildlife for the Department of Natural Resources. And that can be confusing because we have 11 different divisions and we're all marketed as DNR, so it gets really confusing. What we're going to try and cover today, so we're talking about building backyard habitat, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about wildlife dynamics inside of urban areas, because the way the urban environment affects the human-wildlife relationship can have a lot of different effects than what we would typically see. So we're going to try and cover urban conservation, some wildlife trends, what habitat is, which how to create and maintain your own native habitat, and some considerations that you have while making that. So we'll start with conservation, urban conservation, and what I get a lot of my phone calls is, can't you take this animal and take it somewhere else? Or, you can do habitat out there, but not here where I can see it. It'll block the river. It'll block my view shed, whatever it may be, right? So there's a lot of conservation happening out there, like at Eagle Marsh. There is a lot of out there conservation, but Eagle Marsh is partially inside of city limits, right? So there's ways to think about this. So what we have is this idea of urbanization, which is pretty self-explanatory, but essentially cities and towns grow bigger and larger and spread outward as more people start living and working and recreating inside of those urban areas. So that actually means our expanding urban areas means that the out there, this magical out there place that everyone wants me to take every wildlife to, it's actually closer and closer to here. So we have to start reconciling this idea of conservation inside of urban areas and not just in rural. So why this isn't so important, and apologies for some of you that may have seen versions of this portion before. So for a period of about 60, 70 years, we lost green spaces in the United States alone at the rate of 3 million acres a year. That is how drastically we lost green space in the United States. We also know that 2/3 of the world's population will be in some type of an urban area by the year 2050. I think we're actually over that threshold now in the United States. We also know that 60% of that environment is going to be built by the year 2030. We also have it expected that urban's land cover is expected to double by the 2040s. So it's a very rapid acceleration. For me, it's always like, okay, cool, if you had that data from 20 years ago, what of it, right? These are predictions in 2018. So it's only slightly a period over 10, 12 years, right? So it's a very rapid increase. And like I said, in some areas of the world, we've already hit those marks and have gone beyond. We also know that there's over 700 species that can be found in some type of urban environment. A lot of them can be found in backyards. Indiana is arguably one of the most altered states that we have. So you may tell me, well, do your conservation on your state property, right? The problem with that is Indiana is 97% privately owned. That means not state or federally owned, so it could be local government, but the entire crux of this means private landowners have to be invested in putting conservation on them. This is what, and this isn't unique to Indiana, right? 85% of the land east of the Mississippi is privately owned. So like, there's the idea of like Yellowstone where they have these vast Bureau of Land Management properties. Well, that's not east of the Mississippi. We don't have those properties. So this first map is what we think from survey records about coverage of Indiana in the 60s, okay? Fast forward, this is data from 2001. That is what we have done to Indiana, and that is why it's arguably one of the most altered states that we have. So to address this is the idea of urban conservation. So it's the examination of wildlife in areas influenced by the built environment and focuses on the relationship between humans and wildlife in the urban ecosystem. So there's always like this concept that we're only worried about wildlife, but urban conservation doesn't just look at wildlife, it works at the human interaction with the wildlife inside of those areas influenced by the built environment. So it's not just wildlife and it's not just people, it's both and their interactions together. What is frequently happening is urbanites typically alter natural ecosystems thinking that it's not going to attract wildlife, but they're actually just creating new habitats for some wildlife, which take advantage. And this can increase your human-wildlife interactions, and they can be really, really super positive or really, really super negative and everything in between. So some of the trends that we tend to see that are influenced by the built environment. So we typically see a lot more of these successful wildlife that have some of these common traits. In general, they utilize human food sources. They're typically omnivores, so they're not picky about what they eat. They're pretty generalistic in their food as well as their habitat. They're typically really strong competitors, and sometimes that also means they can exclude native species, especially if it's an invasive species. They typically have a higher tolerance of human disturbance, and they are actually much more adaptable to environmental disturbances than other places. So one example is the movement and activity. I actually really hate the fact that I have not figured out a replacement for geese, because there's this perception that geese are not migrating. We have just completed a 5-year study in Indiana saying that this is not true. What is really happening is different geese at different times of year. So what you think is always the same geese, not really the case, right? But there are still pockets and times where you can at least delay the movement, migration, not just for geese, but for other wildlife too. Their movement and activity, if you're feeding them, you could be disrupting their winter behavior, right? It could be for other songbirds, not just geese. We also have increased reproduction for some species. So the best example is the peregrine falcon when they reintroduced them in some of those urban areas, because they were using the skyscraper nesting sites as a replacement for those cliffs. So in some places, and with a urban heat index in urban areas, some birds can actually have 3 or 4 broods when they typically would have 1 or 2, because they have better resources. The increased tolerance of humans, there's a big study showing how raccoons actually are higher in numbers in urban and suburban areas than they are in rural areas, because they have figured out how to deal with us. There's also diet and nutrition, they're getting food from us. Quite honestly, it's probably questionable at best. But they're eating different things, they have access to different resources, and they're also trying to survive different things that they would not normally encounter. Not all wildlife, but some wildlife. So the best example I typically always have is you every year hear about the trick-or-treat pumpkins getting stuck on a deer nose. We recently had a tomato cage stuck around a deer's neck in South Bend, those type of things. And that leads to a lot of things too, because yes, we all want to help everything, but there's really not a lot of resources to do that, guys. And handling deer is really not good if you can help it. They stress really, really easy, and handling them can actually kill them. So there's a finesse to it. So sometimes well-intentioned things don't necessarily lead to the best outcome for the wildlife. So there's also other things to think about. So our management decisions that we have inside of urban areas actually affect how wildlife will change. It is its own selective pressure in evolution. And the other thing to think about, because of the number of people and how typically we choose to manage wildlife, shooting raccoons, that's automatically creating this increased selection pressure for wildlife. So we've done things like urban wildlife has increased their ability to be nocturnal. Coyotes are a really good example of this. For trapping raccoons, they have increased problem-solving abilities. There is a whole thing last June at the International Urban Wildlife Conference where they're actually getting smarter and figuring out how to get out of traps a lot quicker. Yeah? They're high in tolerance and habituation, and they have dietary niches that facilitate reproduction and survival. So there's a lot of things that we're doing and we think is good, but it is having its own effects inside of an urban environment. The other thing to think about is not all cities are the same. Fort Wayne does not behave the same as South Bend, does not behave the same as Elkhart, does not behave the same as Indianapolis. So there's this misconception that all urban areas function the same. There are some common trends, but it's not really the same. They all have different needs. So this is the example of that in this graph. So the selective pressures have changed the boldness over time. So those places that, make sure I tell you right. So the first situation, they still had that competitive release, high number of human encounters, and they had moderate removal pressure. And then in the second scenario, they had weaker removal pressure. So essentially, we're selecting for more bold behavior over time. So that's something that we have to think about when we're thinking about how we're going to manage wildlife. There's also this idea that, so I talked about some of those common traits, right? So they did this big group study at 379 different cities in 48 different countries at over 5,000 species. It was a massive undertaking for this research. And they thought they would find a common urban trait syndrome, right? Which would identify this one common group of traits that are shared by all wildlife across the board. So they did find some commonalities like we already talked about, like being generalists, higher tolerance to humans, those types of things. But they had a lot of other traits that varied. So they had actually, like, the best examples, they had 4 different foraging behaviors, right? So, for example, sorry, I'm making sure I get it right. So beetles, birds, and reptiles, they ended up having smaller body sizes. But the beetles had higher mobility around different sites compared to things like reptiles. Reptiles actually are benefiting by staying put in urban areas, where things like beetles and bees are actually benefiting from having a different foraging style, right? They are also showing that the native bees in urban areas, their tongue was actually shorter and more adapted to those generalist plants that we keep planting out that are really not providing any benefit to wildlife, guys. I know we've taught ourselves that, it's not helping, right? So essentially it's highlighting this need that, like, we can't just provide one type of habitat in an urban area. We have to be thinking about all the wildlife we're trying to trigger and conserve in urban areas. We have to create habitats for different species in different niches. So all these interactions have led to a lot of common wildlife myths. So one of those is feeding wildlife is necessary. I know I'm not the popular person for saying that, but I really don't like feeding wildlife in any capacity.
Yeah, bird feeders? No bird feeders?
I don't like bird feeders either, because it's an artificial food source, artificially inflating the number of birds that would be there normally, increasing your risk of conflict, increasing your risk of disease spread, all those things. So I typically argue your habitat's better, and we're going to cover that why later. But that. So it's this really big, complicated conversation. We just recently had a meeting where the research shows, like, in order to bind conservation, more feeding events should happen. And you could feel the whole group of biologists like, I'm sorry, did you tell us to feed wildlife more? No, like, but if you think about it, it typically has unintended negative effects. It's also led to, like, fledglings and fawns are injured and abandoned. Typically they're not, most of the time they're not. Most of the time the best thing to do is walk away. The concept that predators don't live in or belong in urban settings. The analogy, Chicago and LA has a thriving coyote population. Fort Wayne and Indianapolis are no different. Coyotes are doing very well in urban environments. All snakes are poisonous, but, like, there's this negative connotation with snakes all the time. And then we have the misidentification of species resulting in rumors. So hairless coyotes become chupacabras. Feral cats are always a mountain lion, always. All these, like, interactions, sometimes it's created quote-unquote nuisance problems. I quote that because in our Indian Administrative Code, they are called nuisance animals. So all these species up here, they are considered nuisance animals. I do not like the term because it's already created this negative connotation, like, so all coyotes should be shot, all raccoons, all possums, whatever it may be. Since they're all on here, we've already assumed they're a nuisance. I've gotten calls plenty of time before. I've seen a coyote running across the field, what should we do? Nothing. And the other hard part of this is, if you call me, like, we don't have the capacity to address these wildlife issues. Myself, the law enforcement officers, unless it's a human safety issue, and that's typically, like, a deer's on the side of the road still alive and could cause an accident, that's, like, the type of safety. In general, if it's in the middle of the woods, something's happening, we're not really going to do much about it. It's hard to do that. But we do have things like wildlife and waterfowl control operators. They are, and this is not different than any other state, typically we have these other operators that are able to be hired for money to do those things. So we'll transition to what makes a habitat. There are 4 components of habitat. So you need food, water, shelter, and space. Essentially, if you don't have habitat, you have no wildlife. If you lose it, they disappear. If you build it, they will come. But if you manage it, they will stay. So we were just talking a little bit ago, we also often have, like, these good one-time intentions that are good, but they're not long-term benefits. Like, maybe you replaced all your light bulbs with LED bulbs, right? Okay, that was one action. What's the next step, right? And it's a hard ask because it's always hard work, but that's the idea. What can we do further to keep managing and maintaining and not just do a one-off event to create this buy-in into the communities and create conservation? So I would ask you, in this picture, where is the habitat?
Trees.
Maybe the trees, otherwise, if it helps you know, there's a water feature behind me in this picture. So it's good goose habitat maybe, because it's food and geese can see as far as the eye can see here, right? But essentially, it's a large monoculture of habitat, and a monoculture of any species is bad, even native species, right? On this picture, right? There's more than corn in Indiana, right? That's like the slogan, right? But like, really along the riparian area, but the rest is just monocultures of other fields, right? Again, monocultures are not inherently good for habitat. We talked about space. So when we have urban areas, we have these challenges to movement and connectivity. So things like roadways, splitting up properties, chopping down trees, taking out native abilities for like monarchs to even travel, right? So wildlife uses corridors for things like food and resources, for mating, to find shelter, for dispersal, for things like migration. There's a lot of studies showing about how urban forests are actually really incredibly valuable for bird migration, but it's really hard to do. So habitat fragmentation can cause habitat loss. You can become vulnerable to invasion because already if you're disturbing it, you're creating space for more invasion to occur. Decreasing the genetic diversity and basically breaking down the ecosystem. So we'll talk about the benefits of native habitat. Didn't work. Okay, that's fine. So typically when we think of habitat, we're always thinking of like the wildlife benefits. I think sometimes biologists, conservationists, we kind of do a disservice talking about only about the wildlife. Even though I would probably say that's where my wheelhouse is, but we can't just talk about wildlife all the time. There's many human benefits as well. Improved health. There's multiple studies that showing daily recreation in a green space can reduce heart stress, increase exercise, better mental health, those types of things. If you're using, there's obviously the interconnection ones. Like there's also overlapping benefits that wildlife does not care if you have privacy, right? But like we care. But there's overlapping things that we all share. So things like clean air, water, and soil. We all need that to thrive, right? Having diverse habitat prevents invasions from things that we don't want. By definition, an invasive species has to be causing economic or environmental damage. So that means we're spending a lot of money to take care of it. And it has to be not from here, right? So if we have diverse habitat preventing invasive species, we're arguably spending less money dealing with invasive species. Increasing your pollinators, which is the bottom of the food chain. I think it used to be advertised as 1 in every 3 bites of food was by a native pollinator. If you watch Doug Tallamy's presentations, it's closer to maybe 1 in 12 bites. But still there's some benefit to that. But like even if not, you know, there's still some cross-pollination happening in gardening and the food we eat. You'll have a lot of wildlife that receives direct benefits. So those are the human exploiters that basically, if we're here, they're gonna take advantage of us while they can, right? So things like some pollinators, bees and butterflies, a really good example is the rusty patch bumblebee. They actually found a really good thriving population in an urban area in New York. Can't remember if it was the park or not, but I know it was New York State at least. When we talk about planting milkweed, because butterflies are benefiting from that, because I recently learned that apparently farmers hate milkweed in their fields. It seems like a weird thing to get really upset about, but that's coming from a non-experienced farmer, right? Birds, so some raptors, we talked about the peregrine falcons. Some of our songbirds are probably like your American robin. Some small mammals like squirrels. And they're recently finding more and more information about how some of our small ponds and our HOAs are actually beneficial to herps if we manage them properly. Herps being reptiles and amphibians, for clarification. There's also human adapters. They don't really need us, but if you're going to be here, all right. So things like coyotes and white-tailed deer. I do frequently get the call of, well, we've destroyed the habitat at home. Coyotes and deer are edge species. They thrive wherever we create edges. So they like that forest meets field meets developed area. That's where they shine, right? Like So we can have this idea that, well, we've destroyed their home and their forest here. We probably just invited them in, right? Things like clearing trees have invited coyotes to spread. The red fox, I honestly, in fairness, I don't see red fox a lot. I finally saw the first one on Sunday morning, last Sunday, in my yard, but it is a very common call that I get in urban areas. But the idea is like, it's one health, right? It's the health of the people and the land and the wildlife is all connected. And there's a lot about this in the CDZ and other places. But when we help protect one of us, we are protecting all of us. So yes, I'm probably going to side with wildlife because that's how I am as by nature. But there's ways to also benefit, humans as well. So what can we do to create habitat? And the basic answer is mimic nature. So those rain gardens and bioswales, so slowing down that water, doing native plants, developing those deep root systems that aerate and solidify the soil, creating habitat, and rethinking messiness, which I'm very aware in Fort Wayne is going to be a tricky thing to do because we have, typically in urban areas, all those tricky local ordinances that are very hard to navigate, right? So things like minimizing turf grass. Turf grass has its place, right? When we think about habitat, was really hard to digest. You have to do things differently than if you're going to make a lawn, and that's what's a hard thing to teach. So there's actually a process and a method to the madness. I do have some videos online for this, so I'm not going to go super detailed, but I will try and hit the basics, and if we have questions, we can go. Site selection. Someone always owns the property. That's step one. You got to figure out who owns the property. What are the local ordinances? We've already talked about, like those are tricky. Those are probably the hardest thing I think to navigate, right? What are your long-term goals? How can you maintain it? What are the conditions of the site? There's some things that can do to help with ownership, but none of these are gospel. So like you can go to a county GIS website. Allen County's is actually pretty good. You can go to association boards. Very hit or miss is what I'm finding. Your surveyor's office would probably have the final say. Same with right-of-ways. It can be very tricky, from my understanding, depending on who the owner is, to get a hold of them. So that's tricky too. You can try to go to the city. Unfortunately, I've heard it's hit or miss if the city responds. It depends on the city. You also have to look at what your objectives. Do you have a certain desired species? Do you have a way it should look for you? What's the habitat you want to create? Are you looking for more of a grassland prairie with few forbs? Do you want it more flowers for more of a pollinator habitat? Are you looking for a rain garden to contain water? Are you looking to do trees and shrubs? Maybe you want to put in a wetland, right? There's different options, and you have to look at time to establishment. Look at your resources. Do you have the time, cost, tools, all these other things, right? So what's about this picture? So these are basically the same mix put in by the same person. This is in this is in Huntertown, this is in Muncie, okay? This is like the first year planting, right? These guys are mowing like they were supposed to. These guys are now mowing like they were supposed to. But this is ragweed taller than me. That's what it was. And that can happen when you're planting. You can get foxtail, ragweed, mare's tail coming up in the first year if you've planted. That's fine, it'll get outcompeted, but I guarantee you your neighbors are gonna call and be all sorts of ticked off about it, right? Assess your site, look at the moisture, look at your sunlight, slope, your equipment access, right? If you do have to mow to maintain, probably not gonna get a mower on a steep hill, right? So you have to think about those things. Are you willing to use chemical? Are you not willing to use chemical, right? What is your current cover? Because, and we'll talk about it, you gotta get the site prep. That is the number one thing that you have to do right first, right? And I talked about site prep. If nothing else, remember you need site prep first. If grass is already growing there and you just throw a bunch of seed in there, the grass is already growing. So you have to figure out how that seed's gonna get resources if the grass is already using them. So the basic number one rule is good seed to soil contact. So these are all different sites, they're all prepped differently. Think about where to buy. We do have a seed supplier list. Indiana Native Plant Society, local native plant sales, and Allie's already mentioned one today, right? Indiana Wildlife Federation has a sale. They're talking about their native plant giveaway. Sometimes some of the county and state fairs have one.
McMillan has theirs.
McMillan. Yep, local conservation group, so that was Allie. You can seed it. Typically, I just say frost seed it, which just means when it's really cold out. The freeze-thaw cycle will get that seed to where it should be. You don't need to plant it deep. The correct planting depth for any seed is twice its width. So for the first 3 years, so typically when I'm telling people plant from seed, it is the most economic and it's really effective. It's a lot of upfront costs, but I still maintain it's less than like if you're mowing every week, if you're watering, fertilizing, all those things. But for me, the hardest thing for me is patience, right? These are the most crucial years. So this is where you're spending most time looking diligence for large patches of invasive. I wouldn't drive yourself crazy, right? Like one sprig of garlic mustard, yeah, I understand it can be more, but like prioritize what your ability to do. Yes, you want to get a lot smaller, but like don't panic, right? This is my this is what I've kind of done over the time. It kind of shows you what you should be doing the first 3 years. The best time to begin is in the fall. So for example, I would say that you're starting in fall, let's say last fall, right? Fall 2023, right? You've started killing and site prepping, okay? And then right now when it's starting to green up again, you'll hit it again. And then typically I say follow up one more time and get ready for a winter seeding, because winter seeding typically is what's best to promote those native forms that most people want, right? You don't always need this much time, but again, that site prep is the thing that you don't want to neglect. It's easier to fix a lot of stuff, but if the site prep's not ready, you're wasting your time and energy. Then you want to plant. Dormant seeding is recommended, especially if you want those forms, right? So that means that cold winter scattering up. You can even have snow on the ground. 2 inches or less of snow, it's fine. It can help you see where you've walked, right? If you're going to do plugs or seed, typically plugs I would say before June 15th. If you're using seed, before Mother's Day. I kind of already hit on this, but sometimes that communication can help indicate your areas being maintained and not just being neglected. So educational signage, creating paths and walkways, educating others. Don't plant aggressive species in manicured areas. We have a big project in Goshen where the installer, he's great, he knows all this native stuff, but he's begging us, please don't put cut plant anywhere in the mix because it's going to be a really wet area. And cut plant is a gorgeous plant, but it spreads like wildfire if it's given in the right spot. Plan for all seasons, keep paths cleared. I told you where we ripped out all that burning bush. This path clearing thing has been a very hard lesson for me to learn, but I have learned it. I kid you not, there was literal fights in my office about stuff falling onto the sidewalk, right? We were both stubborn that it wasn't going to go how we wanted, right? But I have now learned, keep it back from the sidewalk, trimming things regularly, that type of thing can be helpful. Learn from my lessons, because I'm telling you, it was literally a fight. Supervising your pets. Love pets. If you're planting native, ideally you're probably wanting those native species to come. I'm a crazy dog mom. I wouldn't want anything to happen to my dogs. I have a dog now. The little one's passed away, but they're going to get stuff, right? Cats, I know, is a whole other topic. Cats are an invasive species when they're not tended on the landscape. They directly kill billions of animals every single year. So love your cat, that's great. But the best way I've ever heard it phrased, treat your cat like a dog, right? It's not acceptable if my dog just runs all over your property, right? Shouldn't be acceptable for your cat to run all over my property either, or tag you or whatever you may have, right? Supervise your pets. It keeps your pets safe. It keeps your wildlife safe. It goes both ways. Keep wildlife wild. Involve the community, especially in an HOA type situation. If they're helping plant, they're probably going to be less likely to demand that you rip it up if they've also done the hard work. I think I've covered everything. I know it probably went really long, but thank you for listening to me, and I would be happy to answer any and all questions. So.
You can get back to